between Albert Einstein and Robert Oppenheimer. And some of the tactics we're going to look for are pins and skewers and discovered attacks. These are all powerful tactics that long-range pieces can employ. All right, well, the game starts with Coach Daniel's favorite beginning move, pawn to e4. And Oppenheimer replied in kind with his pawn to e5. Knight to f3 immediately puts the unprotected pawn in danger. Knight to c6 protects it and gets a piece out of bed, looking at the center. And bishop to b5 is the Spanish opening, also known as the Ruy Lopez opening. Ruy Lopez was a Spanish monk that was a very good player way back. I think it was the 1400s or 1500s. You can Google Ruy Lopez, R-U-Y-L-O-P-E-Z, to get more information about him. But he made this opening popular in Spain, and so that's why it's named after him, or sometimes the Spanish opening. Now this opening, the bishop does not look at the center. A lot of times I'll tell you to move your bishop to c4 to look at the center. Now this doesn't do that, but it looks at a piece that looks at the center. So that undermines the knight's protection of e5. Well, Oppenheimer used Morphy's defense. Paul Morphy was a very famous player in the 1800s. He was probably the best player in the world, and he was from Louisiana. Well, this is how he always answered the Ruy Lopez opening, by putting that bishop in danger. Now, you'll probably remember that I told you not to move your pawn shield pawns in the beginning of the game. All of these pawns are known as your pawn shield pawns. And we teach you, do not move your pawns in the beginning, except to get your bishops out of bed. Do not move your pawns in the beginning. Get all your other pieces out instead. Okay? Rise and shine, wake up your sleepy heads. Get these lazy pieces up out of bed. Rise and shine, wake up your sleepy heads. Get them into the board. So you want to get your pieces out of bed. But there are exceptions. Because this bishop is undefended, the pawn has a good reason. And you'll remember that all principles have exceptions, which means if you have a very good reason, you can go against that principle. So normally you wouldn't want to move these pawns in the beginning, but here Oppenheimer has a good reason, and that good reason is to put the bishop in danger. Likewise, we taught you that if you still have pieces in bed, like the pieces that we see here on the first rank, if you still have pieces in bed, you should avoid moving other pieces a second or third time. Well, we have an exception here. The undefended bishop is in danger, so he has a good reason to move a second time. So he moved bishop to a4, still keeping an eye on that knight, which gives Oppenheimer another good reason to move another pawn. Put the bishop in danger again. And of course, that gives the bishop a good reason to move for the third time. So Einstein played bishop to b3. Well, now there's no more good reasons to be moving any flank pawns. So Oppenheimer wakes up his knight, gets it out of bed, looking at the undefended pawn on e4. And Albert Einstein decided to ignore that unprotected pawn, and he castled. And castling is one of the opening principles. You want to castle to get your king safely behind the pawn shield here on F2, G2, and H2. Sometimes you'll castle the other way to the queen's side and get behind the other pawn shield, but this time the best castling move is here to the king's side. Well, that does still leave the pawn on E4 unprotected, and so Oppenheimer captured it. You'll notice that in capturing that pawn, the knight on E4 is now unprotected. Now remember, the definition of unprotected means that your piece is on a square to which none of your other pieces can move. And since that's unprotected, it becomes a target. And since it's a target, Albert Einstein aims at that target. This is using the power of the long-range rook, not only to put the knight in danger, as illustrated by the yellow arrow, but if you keep looking past the knight, you see that the rook is in line with his opponent's king. Now, the king is always a target, as is the queen. The king because it's the most valuable and most important piece. The queen because it's the most powerful piece. Those two pieces will always be targets. And then any pieces that are not protected should be targets as well. All right, well, now it's time for Oppenheimer to make a decision. He decided to play his pawn to D5. This is a good move. It occupies the center. It protects the knight. It gives more control. Gives black a bit of a space advantage. So that was a good move. Now, Einstein's next move, pawn to A4, probably was not the best move he could have made. Because, first of all, it does not open the door for his other bishop that's still in bed here. This bishop on C1 wants to get out of bed, but he can't because the pawn on D3 is in the way. Probably a better move would have been pawn to D3, putting the knight in danger. And that would have allowed, sorry about that, let's get these arrows off. That would have allowed the bishop on C1 to get out of bed. Einstein played this move because he recognized that the pawn on A6 is a pinned pawn. It's pinned because the rook on A8 is undefended. As you remember from the lesson on undefended pieces, rooks all start out undefended, which usually isn't a problem because there's no easy way to put them in danger. Well, you can see here that the pawn, the idea that Einstein has is to attack the B pawn. And of course, if Oppenheimer plays something like captures, well, then Einstein has this nice nifty little pin where he's looking at the king through the knight, and the knight cannot move because you're not allowed to put your own king in danger, or you're not allowed to move into check. So that would be a pretty good position for white. On the other hand, if Oppenheimer were to make a move that would allow the white pawn to capture, for example, let's suppose Oppenheimer was careless and maybe just brings his bishop out one square, for an example. Well, that allows the B pawn to be captured because the A pawn is pinned. Well, that puts the knight in danger here. And the A pawn cannot capture without losing his rook. If he does, That unprotected rook gets captured, and that creates a what? Another pin, pinning the bishop to the queen this time. So those are things that you have to keep your eyes open for during a chess game. Oppenheimer wanted to avoid all of these things, and so he played his pawn to b4, and we'll look at that move in a moment. I'll put it up here just for a second. That's the move he played. Well, it's not his best choice. He should be looking for ways to get his pieces out of bed. But he was worried about the complications of leaving the pawn there, but he missed a much better move. He could have played his bishop to c5, and look at all the threats that creates. It creates a super attack against the f2 pawn. Remember, a super attack is when you attack one piece with more than one piece. Here, the knight on e4 and the bishop on c5 are putting the f2 pawn in danger. And it's only protected by white's king. When you have more attackers than the opponent has defenders, you can overpower, which means that you'll be the last one standing on that square. And white doesn't really have too many good ways to protect that pawn there, that f2 pawn. He could move his rook back over, but that could create some real difficulty for white. So black missed his best move. He should have played bishop to c5 for many reasons. The first reason, it gets his bishop out of bed. The second reason, it opens a pathway for him to castle his king safely behind his pawns. And the third reason, it creates a super attack and can make life uncomfortable for Albert Einstein. Right, he missed that move. As I mentioned, he played b4 instead. And so, kind of a missed opportunity there. Even moving his other bishop out would have been a better choice. Maybe bishop to g4, because that will now protect the rook with the queen. Or even bishop to b7 would have been okay. But b4 was played, and so we can't cry over spilled milk, but we can learn from it. Well, now Albert Einstein does play the pawn to d3 that he should have played before, putting that knight in danger. This really is going to begin to unleash the power of this rook on e1, the long-range piece, because that knight's going to have to move. And when he does, a super attack is created on the black e5 pawn. Black has only one defender, the knight on c6. And white has two attackers, so white can go ahead and capture with an overpower maneuver. And not only does this overpower the e5 square, but it removes the last black obstacle between white's rook on e1 and black's king on e8. That means a discovered attack is looming. Besides this, the knight on c6 is unprotected. If black's not careful, the white knight can capture the black knight, discover check, and put the queen in danger. And so Oppenheimer played knight to e7 to block the e-file. His only other real choice would have been to capture, which would have allowed a super attack against his d pawn, which is only protected by the queen. That super attack creates a check as well, so it's sort of a fork. So, okay, bishop to e6 would have protected and blocked at the same time, but the point is, Oppenheimer was concerned about allowing such a maneuver, So he blocked the e-file with his knight. But when he blocked the e-file, notice he also blocked the bishop on f8. That bishop now cannot get out of bed. He also blocked the bishop's protection of the knight on c5. So that knight can become a target for Albert Einstein at some point, perhaps. So these are all things to consider in this sequence of moves. The next move Einstein makes is queen to f3. Now, I should say again, this goes against one of the principles of the opening that I have taught, that you want to lead in the fight with your bishop and the knight. So these two guys normally want to get out before the queen gets out, as well as your other two minor pieces. Usually, again, it's a principle, so if you have a very, very, very good reason, you can go against that principle. Well, Albert Einstein's very, very good reason is pretty obvious here, especially since I've drawn the arrows to help you see it. It creates a super attack on the f7 pawn, being threatened now by the knight as well as the queen. And it's threatening checkmate in one move. If black is not careful, let's say, for example, he does something silly like bishop to b7, well, there's checkmate. It's checkmate because the king is in check. He cannot run away to d7 because the knight covers that square. And he cannot capture the queen because the knight covers that square. So because this is a checkmate threat, black must find a way to prevent the white queen from moving to f7. Well, the best way that he could have played would have been bishop to e6. This would protect the pawn with the bishop. It would also help to obstruct the e-file to mitigate the e1 rook's power. And so it would have been a much better move. The move that Oppenheimer played, however, was pawn to f6. This might look good at first because it puts the knight in danger and it keeps the queen from moving to f7 because queens can't jump pieces. The problem is, notice the double-headed blue arrow that I've drawn here on the e8 h5 diagonal. By playing pawn to f6, that diagonal is wide open and susceptible to attack. Notice this next move by white. Queen to h5 check. That not only creates a check, and because the king is in check, black can do nothing but get out of check. He might love to capture the knight on e5, but it's illegal. You cannot make any move that leaves your king in check. And not only does it put the king in check, but it puts the queen in line with the undefended rook on h8, which means that the pawn on h7 is pinned. And so that's important. We'll see why here in a moment. Right now, notice that there are only two ways to get out of this check. He can either block with his knight on e7, or he can block with his pawn on g6. There's no other way out. Nobody can capture the queen, and the king cannot run away because the knight is still covering the d7 square. Well, knight to g6 creates a real challenge for black because white has so many long-range pieces looking at the king. Here the rook is looking at the king. The queen is looking at the king. The queen is looking at the rook on h8. And even though there are pieces in the way, well, that's what creates a discovered attack. White can simply take the knight on g6 with his own knight. Why is that? Well, the h7 pawn is pinned, and a pinned piece cannot do its job. Might look like that it's protected, but it's not, because if we capture the knight and he recaptures with his pawn, his undefended rook is left hanging, and we can capture that with the queen. So that is not protected. Another choice, let's examine another choice very quickly. White could just really even play here. That creates check against the king, and it creates an attack against the queen. Because the king is in check, black must find a way out of check. Well, if he moves the king, the queen gets captured. On the other hand, if he blocks, the queen still gets captured. Or the only other block is to block with the queen. Well, that still gets captured. And so white could just play that move. Well, the queen's only worth, well, I say only, the queen's worth $9, but sometimes it's better to just attack and attack and attack. So this check gets a knight, threatens the rook on h8. The queen is still looking over the knight's shoulder. King has to get out of check, so when he blocks, well, the knight could just take it, or take the rook with another discovered check. So 2 discovered checks in a row. First from the rook, discovered check, then from the queen, discovered check. Winning 8 doll hairs instead of the 9 that he would get with the queen. But the benefit is this: he gets to keep his knight, which he wouldn't be able to do if he had taken the queen. So $8 for free compared to 9 doll hairs in exchange for a 3. And now the bishop is pinned. There's so many attacks that can take place. It's just really terrible for black. Oops, I didn't mean to go all the way back to the beginning. Let's page through here to where we were. All right, so here's where we were before, when we began to evaluate whether knight to g6 would be a good way to stop that check. Well, Oppenheimer must have seen all of those things that we just pointed out, all those possible catastrophes that could happen by allowing the rook a discovered check. So he went ahead and blocked with his pawn. Now that might look good at first, because it might look like the knight on e7 is protecting the pawn on g6. So even though the pawn on h7 is pinned, it might look like the knight on e7 can do the job, but he cannot. Because as soon as our knight captures the pawn, it's a discovered pin. Now the knight is absolutely pinned. You'll remember that an absolute pin is a pin when a piece absolutely cannot move. And the reason is, if the knight moves, the king is in check, and you're not allowed to move in check. So that's called an absolute pin. So the knight cannot take the knight on g6. The knight on g6 is putting the rook in danger. If the pawn captures the knight on g6, the rook on h8 can be captured by the queen. It's a real difficult situation. if he tries to save his rook with rook to g8, well, again, we have all kind of discovered attacks happening. Knight takes knight is a discovered check from the queen. And so the knight cannot be captured because the king has to get out of check. And it's also poised for another discovery if somehow black were to find a way, like blocking with his rook. Well, there's another discovered check from our rook, and now the knight couldn't be captured by the pawn on h7. And so that's not a very pleasant choice. After analyzing all of this, Oppenheimer realized it would be just best to give up his 5 doll hair rook in exchange for white's 3 doll hair knight. This way he's only losing 2 doll hairs. Now, the sad thing for Oppenheimer is when Einstein captures the rook on h8, it creates another pin. So you have an absolute pin of the knight by the rook. You have an absolute pin of the bishop by the queen. Einstein has created so many pins, he could change Oppenheimer's baby's diaper. He's got so many pins. It's amazing. Well, Oppenheimer is a little bit at a loss. Now, he still has 2 pieces in bed. He's got this bishop on c8 and this rook on a8. I really think even though he's in a tight position here, if you take a quick inventory of pieces, Oppenheimer has a rook, Einstein has a rook, Oppenheimer has a knight, Einstein has a knight, Oppenheimer has a bishop, Einstein has a bishop, Oppenheimer has another bishop, Einstein has another bishop, Oppenheimer has a queen, Einstein has a queen, and as far as the other 2 pieces on the board, Oppenheimer has this knight on e7 for Einstein's rook. So that's 2 points in favor of Einstein as far as piece values. And Einstein has 1 extra pawn. So Oppenheimer is not really that far behind when it comes to material. But positionally, he's at a disadvantage because of these pinned pieces. You've got the knight absolutely pinned and the bishop absolutely pinned, so they can't move. But Einstein has his own weaknesses. These 3 pieces are all still in bed. The rook on a1, the knight on b1, and the bishop on c1. So it's not completely hopeless yet. It might be a better idea for Oppenheimer to get some of his pieces out of bed and maybe try to create some sort of countermeasures. But as it is, he decided to trade his knight for Einstein's bishop. This knight does put the rook on a1 in danger, but it can be captured immediately by the c-pawn, although Einstein has a better move. Actually, Einstein did play c captures knight. But usually when you have a pinned piece, like the bishop on f8 is being pinned by the queen, it's almost always best to attack that pinned piece right away. Bishop h6 here would have been an incredible move because it creates a super attack on the bishop on f8. It's attacked now by the bishop on h6 and the queen on h8. And there's only one defender, and that's the king. And so there's no good way to defend that bishop except to move the king to f7, which would create a super defense. Let's say he moves king to f7. Now you have two defenders. That's the only real other hope. He certainly cannot take the rook. Even though it might look like that's a good choice, that would be catastrophic. Because after bishop captures, now the pinned knight is in danger. And now the queen on h8 is poised for a discovered attack. And if the queen gets out of place here, trying to save the queen, because keep in mind, if the bishop is allowed to capture the knight, the queen will be in danger on d8. And then when the king gets out of check, the queen would be captured. So for example, let's say knight captures c2, putting the rook in danger. Well, bishop takes e7 is check from the queen. And that puts the black queen in danger. Well, the king cannot capture the bishop to protect his queen because it's protected by the white rook. And so he has to move out of check. Well, when he does, the queen's a goner. And he's going to be in big trouble. The rook can now move to safety, creating a pin on the knight. And it just is not a pretty picture. And so the only other real choice for black in this position would be to try to save his queen, but that doesn't work. Because after bishop takes knight, there's only one legal way out of check, and that's to run away. And then you have a checkmate. So all those things have to be considered. And so Einstein really had a much better move if he would have played bishop to h6 right away. But instead he played pawn captures the knight. Really, nothing wrong with the move, except that he had such a superior move. But this is not really a blunder, because it does keep some pressure on. But it would allow the king to come to f7, removing the two pins. And now there's not much white can do. I mean, even if he tries to throw in a check here, the bishop can block, and Oppenheimer can be right back into this game with fighting chances. So that's the only real problem with pawn takes knight here. But that is what he played. And as it turns out, Oppenheimer did not realize that the best move would have been king to f7 to get out of the two pins. Instead, he played queen to d6. And of course, this time, the super attack comes. And Einstein didn't miss it the second time. Bishop to h6, super attacking the bishop on f8. That puts a red circle around the bishop because there's only one defender, and it's the king. And the king therefore cannot defend it because the king cannot move into check. So if one of either the queen or the bishop were to take the black bishop, the king could not recapture. There's also no good way to defend the bishop with a second piece. He might love to move the knight here on e7, but it's pinned. He cannot move it. If he were able to move it away, well, sure, then the queen would create a defense, but both those moves are impossible because it would be illegal to move the knight. So Oppenheimer, realizing he's going to lose his bishop anyway, decides to get his king out of the pin and hopefully to safety on the queen side of the board. But no sooner does Oppenheimer remove these two pins that Einstein replaces it with another pin. Bishop captures f8, creating a pin on the knight, pinning the knight to the queen. Now this is a relative pin. Yes, the knight is allowed to move, but if it does, the queen will be captured by the bishop. Like that. So the knight is pinned. So a relative pin means you can legally move the piece that's pinned, but you're going to lose an important relative if you do. An absolute pin means you absolutely cannot move, because to do so would put your king in check. Well, Oppenheimer didn't give up. He created a pin of his own with bishop to b7, pinning the bishop, the white bishop, to the white queen. Now if the bishop moves, the rook can capture the queen. If I'm white, I might just go ahead and play that move. And then you just have an equal trade, but white is still substantially in the lead, a whole rook in the lead, in fact, with an extra pawn to boot. So there's something to be said about simplifying in another lesson. But I want to look at the move that Einstein made, because it was an eggs and bacon move. No, not eggs and bacon. Excellent, not eggs and bacon. An excellent move. When you can do more than one thing with a single move, you've found a good move. Well, Einstein makes a move that does 4 different things. Queen to g7. Queen to g7, number 1, breaks the pin that the black rook had on the f8 bishop. Number 2, it protects the f8 bishop from being captured by the black rook. Number 3, it pins absolutely the knight on e7. Now that knight was already pinned by the bishop, but at least it could have moved if it wanted to. Now it can't even move. It's absolutely pinned. And the 4th thing this move does is it creates a super attack on the knight. The rook is attacking the knight, the bishop is attacking the knight, the queen is attacking the knight. 3 attackers. Black only has 2 defenders, the king and the queen. Well, that means black needs a 3rd defender, or the knight will be overpowered. So, rook to e8 adds the 3rd defender. Well, Einstein's 3 very active pieces are busy keeping pressure on that knight. So he finally wakes up his next knight that was sleeping on b1 for a long time, brings it to d2. Oppenheimer can't move his rook, queen, or king without losing the knight on e7. He doesn't really have a good place to put his bishop. So he decides to start moving pawns. Well, Albert Einstein can now bring his rook into the game. And he puts it on d1 to get it in line with the king and the queen that are standing on the d-file. Only his own knight, his own pawn, and 1 enemy pawn stand between his rook and his 2 targets. which means if he can get those 3 pieces out of the way, the queen would be lost. Well, what does he do? Well, after Oppenheimer makes his move, pawn to a5, and he doesn't have too many good choices. Perhaps it would have been better to move his queen, but he can't move the queen. That's the point. He cannot. The queen is tied to the defense of the e7 knight. Maybe it would have been better to get his king to d8 so that it would still protect the knight and break the pin. It probably would have been better than the 2 pawn moves, is to get these pins broken. Well, this allows knight to c4, putting the queen in danger, removing 1 piece from the rook's pathway. And of course, if the queen tries to move out of danger, say to c6, with the hope of moving pawn to d4 followed by queen to g2 checkmate, that's a good idea, except you never have a time to execute the checkmate. After check, captures with a discovery looming. Okay, here's the checkmate threat. Of course, it would be a blunder for white to capture that pawn with the b pawn, because queen captures g2 is check. But it's white's move. He could create a check here if he wanted to. Discovered check. Or he could create this check. Discovered check from the queen. And then it's just going to be checkmate in a matter of moves. Okay. So none of that appealed to Oppenheimer. So he pretty much had to capture the knight, which allows a discovered pin. Here's another discovered attack and a pin. The queen cannot move to safety. You're not allowed to put your king in check. Well, since he's going to lose his queen, he decided to play queen takes rook. And after rook takes queen, that's another check. Well, you have a super attack going on. The bishop on f8 is attacking the knight. The queen on g7 is attacking the knight. The knight cannot move because the queen is pinning the knight. Right now, the king and the rook are both protecting the knight, and you must have the same number of defenders, because if you have less defenders, you'll be overpowered. So for that reason, king to e6 is the only way to keep the knight from being captured. Well, guess what? White can go ahead and capture anyway, because after black captures back, which might look good because that puts the queen in danger here. But, oops, wrong guy. This rook here can create a skewer. Rook to e1 check. Now, what is a skewer? The skewer is a lot like the pin. The only difference is instead of a piece being stuck in front of a king, a piece is stuck behind the king. And when the king moves, the piece is a goner. The queen is already attacking the rook. And when the king moves out of check, well, now you have 2 pieces attacking the rook and only 1 piece defending it. And that allows for another skewer. Rook takes rook check. The king has to get out of check. And now the bishop can be captured. Well, let's say he tries to protect the bishop. Well, he can't because it's super attacked. It doesn't protect the bishop because the king cannot capture the rook because the rook's protected by the queen. So his only legal move from here would be to move a pawn or to move his king. If he moves his king, white has checkmate in 2 moves. If he moves his pawn instead, either pawn, doesn't matter, it's checkmate in 1 move. The king cannot come to any other square. Also, the king could not move to any square than d6 here. He can't come to d5 because the pawn stops that. Well, anyway, Oppenheimer actually resigned long before that happened. Somewhere over here, Oppenheimer resigned because, as Albert Einstein might say, es ist hoffnungslos. It's hopeless. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and this chess game from Albert Einstein. And I hope you're learning to create pins and skewers and discovered attacks by putting your long-range pieces in line with your opponent's targets. That's to say his king, his queen, and any undefended pieces. I hope to see you soon across the chessboard. Have a great day.